In this week's episode of ShelShocked, we'll be discussing the science of memory, including an interview with famed memory expert Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. And later, Marilyn will provide a good news report about a case of mistaken identity that resulted in the imprisonment of an innocent man, but ended with positive results. So if you're ready out there, get your memory systems recording and brace yourselves for ShelShocked.
Welcome to ShelShocked.
When Marilyn and I first decided that we were going to do an episode on the science of memory, it reminded me of a story that I heard recently about the introduction of the printing press. It turns out, according to this story, that pundits worried that literacy would destroy people's memory capacity.
Wow.
After all, if everything's written down and people could just refer to the printed page, why would anyone ever bother to memorize anything?
Wow.
Which is so funny because that's not the way it's turned out at all. But it reminds me of a story I once heard about Albert Einstein. According to this apocryphal story, someone asked him for his phone number and he went to look it up in the phone book. And the friend said, "You're the smartest guy in the world and you don't know your own phone number?" And Einstein supposedly replied, "I never memorize anything I can look up elsewhere."
Wow.
I don't know if that's true, but I've used that line a lot over the years.
Wow, that's great. It's funny because nowadays with cell phones, people don't know anybody's phone numbers. I was thinking the other day, and I calling somebody, and I was like, what is their phone number? This is something I should know in case of an emergency.
Yeah, memory is such a funny thing. There's so much research on it, and yet it's one of those things that the more research you have, the more questions you come up with, not necessarily answers. And I know that's generally true in a lot of the sciences, but it seems to especially be true with memory. We just don't know all that much about how we produce memories, what memory production looks like in the brain. We know that it must be chemically related. We know a lot of correlates, but we don't have a lot of answers.
Yeah, and things keep changing all the time. I think the most recent research that I had read was that individual memories are stored in individual neurons.
Yeah.
And so we're finding out more and more, but like you said, every time we find out something, more questions pop up.
Right. And that there are backup systems too, so that if you were to lose those neurons, then you could have a storage somewhere else of that same memory. It's so interesting to me and baffling, especially the neuroscience that we found out relatively recently. There's this new research that's highlighting how vulnerable our memories are. And that has not been the leading thinking on this subject. For decades, scientists generally believe that memories that have been consolidated are somewhat set in stone and unchanging, except, of course, for the possibility that you could forget memories or forget parts of the memory. But they believe that any memory that you recalled would pretty much be as solid and accurate as it was when you memorized it. And they also believe that the key to retaining accurate memories was to recall them as often as possible. But now both of those notions are being challenged. For example, there's a neuroscientist at McGill University in Montreal named Karim Nader, and he's showing in his research that the truth about memory may be quite different. His studies are suggesting that our memories are vulnerable to being reconsolidated over time, and even more horrifying, that the more we recall them, the more likely it is that new incorrect information will be incorporated into them.
Fascinating. It boggles the mind that, these memories that you have could be completely different than the original memory.
Right. Nader's work is in direct contradiction to work done by people like Eric Kandel, who's a neuroscientist at Columbia University in New York. He's been doing research for over 50 years, Kandel has, and he actually shared the 2000 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his breakthrough in research on short-term memory. But Kandel believed and still believes, I'm sure, that memory production is like writing things on a pad with a pen. So while the ink is still wet, it's possible to smudge a word or two, but once the ink dries, you can read that piece over and over again with no possibility of change. If you lose that slip of paper and completely lose the memory, that's one thing, but as long as you know where the paper is, you're golden. But around 1999, Nader started doing some research with rats that contradicts that completely. What he did was he taught 4 rats that if they heard a high-pitched beep, it signaled a mild electric shock. That part, as you know, is easy because rats can learn stuff like that after just a single trial. But after the conditioning, the rat would just freeze in place whenever the tone was played, waiting for the electric shock. So what Nader did was he waited a full 24 hours for the memory to consolidate in these 4 rats, and then he brought them back in and he played the tone to reactivate the memory signal, but this time he had injected a drug into their brain that prevents the neurons from making new proteins that would be necessary for creating a memory. What he predicted was that if memories are only consolidated once, the first time that they're created, the drug wouldn't matter because they had already created the memory. But if memories have to be at least partially rebuilt every time they're recalled, down to the synthesizing of neural proteins, then the rats given the drug might later respond as if they had never heard or never learned the fear. Turns out that's exactly what happened. These rats no longer responded to the tone, and this study completely contradicts Candle and others' standard conception of memory. But interestingly, it confirms work by people like Elizabeth Loftus, who's my interview subject for this episode later on, because what she's showing overall is that it's relatively easy to create new memories in people of things that never happened or to alter the memories they've already stored. And this would be predicted by Nader's research because it shows that these rats were re-memorizing every single time they brought up the memory.
Yeah, and it sounds like, that the rats, that memory of the rat had to, was really powerful, the shock, association there. And it's sort of the idea that people have that we wouldn't forget those, what we call flashbulb memories.
Yes.
Those emotional events, like the Boston bombing or whatever, that I will never forget where I was when I heard that, or I will never forget this moment. And for most common people out in the street, they can't fathom that they could forget that moment or that they could alter it and that they might be misremembering. But I do believe they did studies right after 9/11, and they've had people keep coming in year after year and writing down exactly where they were when it happened, what they were doing. And like you said, with Loftus's research, they find that these memories are changing. So even very emotional ones where you think, no way, I'll never forget this, unfortunately, these memories do get altered.
Anybody who's living here in the United States and was, over the age of 5 at that time probably remembers exactly where they were when they first heard of the attacks. Interestingly, even people who were there have apparently false memories of where they were, what was going on. People who were watching it on television came to believe that that first day they saw
both planes, right?
Yeah, both planes going in. And it turns out that no, that wasn't the case at all. Later on, they saw footage or they heard stories or what have you, but they couldn't possibly have seen that first plane flying into the World Trade Center on television that day because they didn't have that footage yet.
Right. Yeah. So it's very good evidence of what they're misremembering.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder because memory is such a personal thing for us. It's the story of our lives. It's the story of our experiences, and it tells us who we are. And when someone comes along and suggests that some of that might be false, I think it's a really personal accusation, and people don't like it.
Yeah, I have a exercise that I have my students do when we do the memory chapter, and I have them recall an emotional memory that they shared with someone else. So I tell them, if they were abducted by aliens by themselves, they can't use that memory. But if they have one where somebody else experienced it with them, they write down what happened, the other person writes down what happened, and then they compare and contrast. And I'm always fascinated with any differences. The student always says, oh, but I'm right.
Yeah.
And she or he was wrong. it never fails to amaze me that, their memory is exact and the other person is wrong.
Yeah, the possibility that somehow you could be wrong about something that you bring up in your mind, that you can see in your mind's eye, that's a terrifying prospect for us. So I think our natural response to that is to say, nope, can't happen. I'm right. They're mistaken. I think we're all comfortable with the idea that we forget. But the idea that you remember something and that's not true, that's a different proposition altogether.
Yeah, it's fascinating, though.
It is. And another thing that this brought up for me was whenever I have a friend who has a baby, the first thing that I buy them is the entire set of DVDs of Schoolhouse Rock. And so that's for the kid. And when the kid gets a little older, that's how they're going to learn a noun is a person, place, or thing. I'm just a bill and all those things. And so it brings up this subject of memory with music. When it's set to music, if you play that song, just the melody, people will start remembering that a noun is a person, place, or thing. It's just such an easy way to remember things. I'm fascinated by that too.
Yeah, clean up, that Barney's annoying song. And,
Yes.
Anytime I turn on 80s or 90s music in the car and I haven't heard something in years, all of a sudden I can sing every single word.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what I wore last week or what I ate for dinner last week or something trivial like that. But bring out a song that I haven't heard in ages and I have no problem remembering.
Have you heard about these people who have superior autobiographical memory?
Yes, like Mary Lou Henner?
Yeah, from Taxi, the actress from Taxi. They have perfect recall of every day of their lives, pretty much everything. They remember the weather, the day of the week, what they had for lunch. It's incredible, and it makes me think, how much of my life do I actually remember? I don't think I remember very much of it.
I know, I don't either. But you also told me, I believe, that they also remember all the bad things that happened to them.
Yes, and there's one woman in particular, Jill Price. She's the author of a book called The Woman Who Can't Forget. She seems tormented by this condition. Unlike the other half dozen or so that I've seen interviews with of people who have this condition, she re-experiences the emotion of the memory every time it's brought up. And so even the tragic, embarrassing, terrifying events of her life, she has to relive them every time the memory gets brought up. So I would not want to have that condition, obviously. But I do kind of want to know what happened every day of my life.
I can't remember, when I think about it, what it was like to be 10 or, even 15 or even, just a few years ago.
Yeah. Do you remember your teachers' names? I did for a while and now I can't. Grade school.
No.
I don't either. I remember certain ones. Mrs. Barrett, because she was my kindergarten teacher, and behind her back we called her Barrett the Parrot. Because she had this cockatoo-like hairdo.
And there's the rhyming again.
Yeah, there it is, yeah. Mrs. Joke was my third grade teacher. It's an unusual name, and she was the first Japanese person I ever knew. And I was fascinated by her. And so that stands out in my mind. But the rest of them, I don't know who was my second grade teacher, who was my fourth grade teacher. I have no memory of that whatsoever. My mother doesn't remember any of her childhood.
Really?
No, she says, I have no memory of anything until about high school.
Wow. And does she have pictures to look back on?
No, not many.
No. Okay,
no.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if we do remember, before high school, do we really remember, or is it that pictures my mom has taken, stories my mom has told
me,
that those have become memories rather than do I really have those memories myself?
Yes.
These are all these questions that come up when you start studying the research about how easy memory is reconstructed.
Right. The difference between implicit and explicit memory comes up as well in this discussion. When you're born, the area of your brain, as you well know, called the hippocampus, is not fully functional until around the age of 3 years. So up until that time, we're learning skills through implicit memory production, but we're not remembering things like the movie theater of the mind production through explicit memory. But sometimes you'll run across people, or at least I have, who say, no, I remember being an infant.
Right.
And I say, well, I know that it probably seems that way. No. I actually met one woman who said she remembered being in the womb.
Oh, goodness. Your brain's not even formed at that point. The areas required for memory aren't formed at that point.
I said, what do you remember? And she said, I remember the sounds. I remember my mother's heartbeat. And I said, don't you think that could possibly just be, fantasy? No, I absolutely remember it. And we're back to, like with your students, saying, nope, those other people are wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm right. I remember it. But, of course, we know that can't possibly be true. We have all the neurological evidence. We have the, anecdotal evidence. At a certain point, you just have to go, well, that's great, and walk away, because you can't convince someone.
Right. I also find it very interesting, what kind of memories you lose through certain diseases. And I remember watching a video clip about a gentleman who had some kind of degenerative disorder that was eating away the neurons in his temporal lobe. And when they showed him pictures of animals, the only the only animals he could remember were dog and cat. And so whatever animal they showed him, it was either a dog or it was a cat.
Wow.
And he had lost the words for all other animals. I don't know if you've heard of the documentary Alive Inside.
No.
It just came out recently, and it was put together by a social worker who wanted, again, we're bringing up music, to bring music to Alzheimer's patients. But not just music, but their individual type of music. And there is this video of this gentleman who they put pictures of his family on his tray, and he just has his head down, is very depressed. And they say, who's this? And he just doesn't answer, mumbles and doesn't really respond. And then he really liked Rob Calloway. Is that his name? Rob Calloway, I believe, in the 40s. And so they put some on music of his on the iPod and then play it for him. And all of a sudden, he's smiling, his head picks up, he's moving it around, and he's talking about all the people in the pictures and telling stories about them. It really, they came alive.
Wow.
And with the music.
And it's Cab Calloway, a jazz singer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes.
So that seemed to tap into something in his mind that allowed him access to some of those memories.
Yeah, so they were still there, and for some reason he couldn't access them. And the music was brought him back.
Wow. Our guest interview today is with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Dr. Loftus is a cognitive psychologist and a distinguished professor of social ecology and professor of law and cognitive science at the University of California, Irvine. She's perhaps best known for her groundbreaking research demonstrating the fallible and malleable nature of human memory, especially in the areas of the misinformation effect, eyewitness testimony, and the nature and creation of false memories. She's the recipient of numerous academic awards and is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry's Executive Council. She's also served as president of the Association for Psychological Science, the Western Psychological Association, and the American Psychology Law Society. Although she's the author of numerous books, I have to say my favorite is Witness for the Defense, The Accused, the Eyewitness, and the Expert Who Put Memory on Trial, which she co-wrote with Catherine Ketchum. Dr. Loftus, thank you so much for being on ShelShocked.
Oh, yes, my pleasure.
So let me start out by asking you, how did you first get interested in memory research?
Oh, gosh, well, that goes way back when I was in graduate school. I actually took a course with a professor who was starting to do some memory research and asked me if I wanted to participate in this research project. And so, way back when I was doing this, early work on semantic memory for words and concepts and basic general knowledge about the world. And it was really quite a bit later, actually, after I'd already finished my PhD, that I thought, I really would like to study something that has more immediate social and relevance and practical applicability. And so it was then that I combined my experience in the study of memory with my interest in legal cases and started studying people's memories for crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events. So I guess that's how it happened.
The definition of memory that's included in the general psychology textbook that I use is simply the persistence of learning over time. Would you add anything to that definition that most people probably don't know about memory?
Well, I think that the persistence of learning over time only tells part of the story. One of the things that we know about memory is it doesn't work like a recording device. You don't just kind of record the information and play it back later. The process is much more complex, and it actually involves a constructive quality. So when we try to remember something, we're taking bits and pieces of experience, but sometimes pieces that we acquired at different times and places, and bringing it together to construct what feels like a memory. And this is part of the reason why errors can creep into memory, because of the constructive nature.
Some of the studies you've published on memory have shown that it's possible to actually create memories, false memories in people in the lab. How do you go about doing that?
It depends on the particular study. In some of my studies, we will show people a simulated crime or an accident, and then we'll suggest to them details that were different from the way things really were. We'll suggest to them that the car went through a yield sign instead of a stop sign, for example. And when we suggest mistaken details, we can very often get people to believe and remember that they saw those details that were only suggested to them after the fact. But in later studies, we showed you can go a whole lot further with people, and you can actually plant entirely false memories into the minds of people for whole events that never happened.
So are you saying this is something we all experience at some point?
Actually, I believe that certainly we all possess a malleable memory, one that virtually all of us possess this malleable memory that is susceptible to potential contamination. And out there in the real world, we pick up misleading details if we talk to somebody else about some event that we might have jointly experienced, and that somebody else mentions something that's erroneous, we can adopt that as our own memory. If we get interviewed by somebody who's biased, we can be led to believe that events happened differently than they really did. There are lots of situations where our memory is exposed to erroneous information that can contaminate. And lots of times it doesn't even matter very much. But when somebody's liberty is at stake, then it matters very much.
Speaking of that, I have a personal connection to this topic. I grew up in Bakersfield, California, where back in the 1980s, about 36 people were arrested and, as it turns out, wrongfully imprisoned after being accused of ritualistic torture and sexual abuse of their own children.
Oh, the famous Kern County cases.
Yes, and it was such a shocking case that Sean Penn made a documentary about it a few years back called Witch Hunt. Have we learned anything since the 1980s about the interrogation tactics that we use?
Well, I think we've learned quite a bit, and a large number of articles have been published about biased and suggestive questioning and how it can be particularly dangerous with young children, and how it can and did and still does lead to the development of horrific false memories in the minds of people that can ruin other people's lives. But, I mean, I think we're waking up to the problem here in the United States, but unfortunately in other parts of the world, and still here, you are seeing people accused based on memories that have been either inadvertently, well, let's give people the benefit, inadvertently planted in the minds of other people.
There have been a lot of high-profile cases over the years that relied upon eyewitness testimony, for instance, with questionable impact. Do you think we should disregard eyewitnesses, or is there some rubric we can use to evaluate the statements that they make?
Well, first of all, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of eyewitness testimony, and perhaps we wouldn't want to, because some eyewitness testimony is very reliable, and some, serious crimes depend on relying on good eyewitness testimony to get those crimes solved. But there are lots of things we can do along the way to minimize the problems of contaminated memory that leads to these injustices. And these things can take place at all kinds of different points in the legal process. So greater care in interviewing witnesses in the first place, greater attention to how procedures are implemented that try to extract information from witnesses. I mean, a lot of little decisions need to be made. Like when you bring a witness to a police station and you want to show them a lineup, how should you construct that lineup, and what kind of instructions should you give to a witness, and how do you avoid giving the witness feedback after some identification, because you don't want to contaminate the witness, you don't want to artificially inflate the confidence. Then there are things that can be done in the trial. So some states are implementing the use of more detailed jury instructions that can educate juries about the nature of memory. Some places are seeing greater use of expert testimony as a way of educating the jury about the factors that affect memory. So these are just a few of the things that are being implemented or considered at different places across this country.
One of the people who seems to be on trial these days, at least in the court of public opinion, is NBC Nightly News anchor Brian Williams. He was making headlines lately for a number of false statements he included in his news stories, especially about his time in Iraq as a war correspondent. For those who are listening who don't know, he apparently claimed that the Army helicopter he was flying in was shot down by ground fire, which was later shown to not be the case, which he also admitted. The immediate conclusion by many seemed to be that he was just blatantly lying to embellish his story. Do you think there's an alternative explanation here?
Oh, I absolutely do. I mean, yes, he was reporting as recently as this year that the helicopter that he was in was hit by this ground fire. I don't know if he went so far as to say it was shot all the way down, but it was hit. The actual events that happened back in 2003, approximately, revealed that another helicopter was hit, and he arrived on the scene to see this damaged helicopter an hour or so later. And so the question is, how did his memory kind of morph into, I saw another helicopter be hit too, and mine was also hit. And, I think that just a distortion of memory in a way that maybe makes him look a little bit more interesting, that his experience was a little more harrowing. These are the kinds of distortions that lots and lots of people make. And so I'd say give him the benefit of the doubt. What's happened afterwards with this deepened investigation is we apparently find out that he's done this on some other occasions as well, but that still doesn't mean that he's a deliberate fabricator. He could be a serial memory distorter.
And he's not the only one. I remember hearing you talk about a case with Hillary Clinton doing something very similar.
Yes, actually, the Hillary Clinton example, was my favorite example before Brian Williams came on the scene with his distorted memory or whatever you think it might be. But it wasn't that long ago when Hillary Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency that she talked about landing in Bosnia under sniper fire. And subsequently, photographs and videos would reveal that, in fact, that didn't happen. It was a very peaceful greeting ceremony. And she came forward with an apology. She said, "I made a mistake. That proves I'm human." And it was interesting because that seems to have been accepted, which I think is fine. But the world has not been as kind to Brian Williams, who basically has been suspended from his job.
And in both of those cases, I think you've got people who are traveling a lot. With Brian Williams, you have someone who's under war conditions. Do you think there are certain conditions under which we're most likely to be vulnerable to false memory?
Well, I would think that if you have lots of experiences and lots of things happening in your life, lots of traveling and lots of conversations, that it would be especially easy to mix up details of things that may have happened to you at different occasions, at different places, different times.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I want to share a personal story. Since learning about your research, I came to recognize that I have a false memory. I remember standing on the front porch of our home, holding my grandmother's hand. I had to have been 3 years old because my parents were bringing home my baby sister from the hospital. Never happened. And there's great
how
detail.
How do you know it never happened? How did you find out it never happened?
I talked to my mother about it, and she told me I was out of my mind, that never happened, that I wasn't even home when the baby came home, and that my grandmother never babysat us.
Well, okay, there you go. So I thank God you still have your day job.
Exactly. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Where can people go to learn more about you and find out what you're up to these days?
Oh, well, I have my University of California, Irvine website has just a whole lot of articles. People can just help themselves to any of these articles that will describe some of these memory experiments and some of the memory issues in a whole lot more detail.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
The Science Report.
For me, the field of psychology has always existed as two interlocking worlds. One is the lab, where the science of human behavior is teased apart, examined, classified, and hopefully understood. In the other, the principles of behavioral science play out in the real world, in our lives. It's in this environment that the most powerful effects of this field of study can be seen. Sometimes, if we're lucky, the application of psychological knowledge can improve society and make our lives better. Unfortunately, mistakes are made, and when that happens, the consequences can be devastating. One such example can be found in the claims of satanic ritual abuse of children beginning in the early 1980s. In a series of cases across the country, accusations by children led to hundreds of innocent people being charged with the most vicious crimes imaginable: torture, exploitation, and sexual abuse of children, sometimes accompanied by occult or satanic ritual. The town I was born and raised in, Bakersfield, California, is a rural setting in Kern County, with a rich history of agriculture stretching back to the Dust Bowl days, when displaced and ruined farmers immigrated with their families in search of a better life. Even today, a large percentage of Bakersfieldians have direct lineage to Oklahoma, Kansas, or North Texas, a fact that's still reflected in the strongly conservative social and political attitudes there to this day. Church attendance is still very high, and Republican politicians in the state are assured an easy victory in the county each election year. These facts made Bakersfield a ticking time bomb back in the early 1980s. One that finally exploded when Debbie and Alvin McEwen were arrested on charges that they had molested their own children on multiple occasions. According to the children's step-grandmother, Mary Ann Barber, a woman with a history of psychosis and treatment for mental illness, the children had disclosed to her that they had been taken to motel sex parties, shared with other adults for sex, and even hung from hooks while being molested. Eventually, these accusations would spread to friends of the McEwens, other relatives, and to other people who dared to speak out on their behalf. The atmosphere of Kern County quickly transformed itself from bucolic farming town to one of intimidation, fear, and suspicion that would end with more than 36 innocent people being imprisoned, given hundreds of years each for crimes they never committed. Although these accusations seemed beyond belief, this wasn't the first such story to be told. Only 2 years earlier, a book entitled Michelle Remembers had rocketed to the bestseller list. It chronicled the repressed memory therapy undergone by Michelle Smith with the help of her psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder. In the book, Smith reveals details of abuse in over 600 hours of testimony while under hypnosis. Her claims were that she was a victim of sexual abuse in a satanic cult that her mother forced her to attend. Smith alleged that she was abused for the first time in 1954 at the age of 5. In this 81-day ritual, she claims leaders of the cult summoned the devil himself, and Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and Archangel Michael later removed all of her bodily scars as well as all memory of the traumatic events, quote, until the time was right. Smith claimed that the abuse continued throughout her childhood, during which she was sexually assaulted, locked up in cages, and even forced to witness a number of murders of adults and babies, sometimes being covered in the blood of these victims. Smith and Pasder consulted a variety of church authorities, and were even interviewed by representatives from the Vatican, all the while their story being taken at face value, accepted uncritically as fact. Their efforts were so successful, in fact, that Oprah Winfrey interviewed Smith on her show some years later. The only problem with the story is that it apparently never happened. Many now believe the whole thing was the result of a mixture of fantasy, leading questions on the part of Pasder, a general hyper-religiosity on the part of Smith, and a pseudo-therapeutic technique known as recovered memory therapy, in which methods such as hypnosis, guided imagery, and sometimes sedatives are used to help patients retrieve lost or repressed memories. These techniques are generally considered to be quackery by scientists today, but they were very much in vogue in the 1970s and 80s. So it was shocking, but not unheard of, when local papers in Bakersfield began running stories of adults being accused of very similar crimes against children. The fact that these were their own children just made them seem all the more reprehensible, and it seemed like a career maker to local District Attorney Ed Jagels, a tough-on-crime prosecutor who once used California's 3 strikes law to send a man to prison for 25 years for stealing a packet of mini donuts. Although many of the convictions were later overturned, there were 3 tragedies in the Kern County molestation witch hunt. The first are the adults who were imprisoned, some of them for decades, for crimes they never committed. The second is the general public, who are now in some ways more in danger of allowing real cases of child abuse to go unnoticed, since their opinion of such cases is strongly influenced by the crying wolf perception of past accusers. And the third, and perhaps most tragic of all, are the children, who will have to find a way to live with the knowledge that they helped send their own parents to prison, and some of whom still believe they were molested, showing the malleable nature of human memory under these strenuous conditions. As a former Bakersfieldian, 2 facts stand out for me in the Kern County cases. One is that the judge in the main cases, whose in-court decisions handicapped defense attorneys at every turn, sometimes bringing gasps from those present, lost his bid for district attorney against Ed Jagels, partly due to public perception that he had been soft on child molesters. The other is that the social workers who originally questioned the children for hours upon hours had recently been through a district training program that included excerpts from Michelle Remembers, the book that began the witch hunt in the first place. The good news is that we now know much more about the vulnerability of human memory, and law enforcement officials, as well as attorneys, are more aware than ever how to question people, especially vulnerable populations like children, without altering their testimony. So let's hope that the world of the psychology lab continues to inform the real-world application of behavioral science so that we can avoid such injustices in the future.
really like?
Hi, this is Marilyn, and I'm bringing you the good news. In this week's story, I'll tell you how two very unlikely people, a woman and the man she accused of a rape, became best friends and have made it their mission to speak out about the fallibility of memory and eyewitness identification. Let's start at the beginning. In 1984, Jennifer Thompson was 22 and a student at Elon College in North Carolina when a man broke into her house during the night and raped her. As he assaulted her, she memorized his face, his voice, everything she could about him. She intended to survive, and when it was over, she wanted to put him in prison for what he did. After the rapist assaulted her, she offered to make him a drink, and when he incredibly agreed, she fled the house, wrapped only in a blanket. A couple living next door let her into their house and called police. Just hours after her ordeal, after doctors swabbed her for semen samples in a hospital, she sat in a police station with Detective Mike Golden, combing through photos, working up a composite. She picked out his eyebrows, his nose, his pencil-thin mustache. Her description seemed to fit Cotton, who was her same age. He had had several minor scrapes with the law, and several years earlier, when he was 16, he had sneaked into his girlfriend's bedroom through a window and was caught snuggling with the girl by her mother. The mother called police, and Cotton was charged with several offenses, including breaking and entering and sexual assault. The charges were all eventually dismissed, but Cotton's name and mugshot were now on file. Investigators showed Thompson a number of photos of possible suspects. She now knows that her mind was trying to find the person in the group who most closely resembled the sketch she had helped the police artist draw. With 6 photographs in front of her, she was consciously trying to figure out the person in the photographic lineup that most closely resembled the sketch, as opposed to the actual attacker. She picked Cotton. Later, police put him in a physical lineup, and she picked him again. It was 100% certain, she said. After a 2-week trial and only 40 minutes of jury deliberation, on January 17, 1985, the day Cotton was sentenced to life, Thompson toasted her victory with champagne. In prison, Cotton spent his nights writing letters to lawyers, newspapers, anyone who would listen. He spent his days pounding the punching bag. He joined the prison choir. He read the Bible. He tried to believe what his father kept telling him, that someday justice would prevail. One day, about a year after Cotton was convicted, another man joined him working in the prison kitchen. His name was Bobby Poole. He was serving consecutive life sentences for a series of brutal rapes, and he was bragging that Cotton was doing some of his time. Cotton hated Poole, even planned to kill him. Cotton's father begged him not to. If you kill Bobby Poole, then you really do belong behind these bars. And when he learned he had won a second trial, his heart filled with hope. The reason that he won another trial was that another woman had been raped just an hour after Thompson. Same Burlington neighborhood, same kind of attack. Police were sure it was the same man. An appeals court had ruled that evidence relating to the second victim should have been allowed in the first trial. At the new trial, witnesses would get a look at Poole, who was subpoenaed by Cotton's lawyer. Finally, Cotton thought he would be set free. He had forgotten the power of Jennifer Thompson. During that time, Thompson's memory cemented Cotton's image as that of the attacker. Back on the stand, she looked directly at Poole and directly at Cotton. Cotton is the man who raped me, she told the jury. The second victim was less convincing, but she pointed to him too. Ronald Cotton hung his head. He had no words left inside him. The court felt silent as he was sentenced to a second life term. The years in prison were a nightmare. He just had to keep himself together, which wasn't easy at all. He was missing his family and his loved ones. He took it day to day and hoped that true justice would prevail and open a door for him. Cotton's break came in 1995 when he was watching the O.J. Simpson trial on television. Attorneys and investigators kept talking about DNA evidence, something he had never heard of before. He contacted his attorneys, who were able to recover one tiny sample of sperm from the rape kit that had been used to treat Thompson 11 years earlier. There was enough DNA in the sample to prove Cotton was innocent and Poole was guilty. And just like that, Cotton was a free man. It was like a dream come true. He couldn't believe it. The warden of the penitentiary called him in his office and told him he was going home the next day. He told him, "Please don't pull my leg. It's already long enough." But it was true. He finally went home to be with his family and loved ones. Cotton then began the difficult task of beginning a new life. He got some money, $5,000, in compensation from the state of North Carolina, but he also worked 2 jobs to get himself back on his feet. As for Thompson, she was torn apart by the revelation that her dead-certain testimony had imprisoned an innocent man. I was devastated. I really was. One of the things that is really important is I never felt any shame being a rape victim. I knew that I had been innocent that night. I now felt this debilitating guilt and shame over 11 years of a man's life that was just gone. She lived with her mental torment for 2 years before finally reaching out to Cotton. Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton met for the first time at a church not far from where Jennifer had been raped. She physically couldn't stand up, she says. She started to sob. She looked at him and said, "If I spent every minute of every hour of every day for the rest of my life telling you that I'm sorry, can you ever forgive me?" He did the one thing that she had never imagined. He started to cry, and he said, "Jennifer, I forgave you years ago." 13 years after her attack, Jennifer just wasn't angry anymore. Parts of her that had been broken for so long, she could feel them fusing again, she says. It was like she was literally looking at grace and mercy. He was sitting in front of her, grace and mercy. Ronald gave her back her life that day. In the years since that first meeting, Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton have become friends. She has asked him how he managed to forgive her for a mistake that stole over a decade of his life. And he says that if he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, if he was going to die there, he had to find a way to live without anger and bitterness. He learned how to forgive so that he could survive. Despite Ronald's forgiveness, it would take years before Jennifer was able to forgive herself. Indeed, she forgave her rapist, Bobby Poole, before she forgave herself. "I forgave Bobby Poole because I watched Ronald forgive me," she says. "I wanted that same peace. I didn't want to live in hate and anger anymore." A few days after meeting Cotton, Thompson wrote to Poole in prison. She asked if he would meet her. Poole never responded. He died of cancer in prison in 2000. In the years since Cotton and Thompson have become friends, Thompson became and continues to be an outspoken opponent of the death penalty, using her celebrity to talk about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. While she hates the time away from her family, she says, it's something she just feels that she has to do. Maybe she can prevent just one innocent person from being imprisoned or sentenced to death. Maybe through her work with abused children, she can prevent just one child from growing up to be another Bobby Poole. She and Cotton talk often. "Ron just calls to make sure I'm doing okay," Thompson says. "He is an amazing human being. He has been a real good teacher for me. He has taught her about forgiveness and healing and faith. He has taught her not to feel like a victim anymore." She has also helped him too, lobbying to change laws so that Cotton would be entitled to more than the $5,000 measly dollars the state originally offered as compensation. She wrote letters to legislators. She gave endless interviews. Cotton eventually got a settlement of nearly $110,000. Cotton's first job after his release was with the DNA company that conducted the tests that exonerated him. He now works second shift for a company that makes insulation. He has bought a house in Mebane, 62 miles of Winston-Salem. He married a co-worker and had a child. In 2009, Thompson and Cotton wrote a book together, Picking Cotton, a memoir of injustice and redemption. They continue to travel together too, giving talks about the way that memory can deceive us. Together, they have successfully lobbied state legislators to change compensation laws for the wrongly convicted, to abolish the death penalty, to revise police eyewitness lineup procedures, and for many other causes. Being the more vocal of the two, with Cotton on her side, Thompson was a member of the North Carolina Actual Innocence Commission, worked with the North Carolina legislature to pass the Racial Justice Act, and has worked in the legislatures of New Jersey, Ohio, Connecticut, and Montana as they have considered judicial reforms. She has appeared on Oprah, 60 Minutes, The Today Show, Good Morning America, 2020, The View, NPR, Diane Reeves, PBS Frontline, A&E American Justice, Sundance winner After Innocence, People Magazine, Redbook, Newsweek, and in other media outlets. Her op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Durham Herald-Sun, and the Tallahassee Democrat. Her writings have appeared in NPR's This I Believe, the Albany Law Journal, and in other outlets. As of today, Thompson and Cotton continue to speak before a variety of audiences about race, class, judicial reform, human error, and forgiveness. In 2013, she was appointed to a 3-year term as an alternate member of the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission, the only judicial body in the United States with the power to free inmates from prison on the basis of the actual innocence. Just in April of this year, Thompson received the 2015 Frank Lee Smith Innocence Award from the Innocence Project of Florida, Inc. in Tallahassee, Florida. How amazing that this terrible ordeal has brought about a great friendship and change for the better. This is Marilyn, and this has been The Good News.
Well, kids, that's the show. I just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone for listening and to send a special thanks out to each of our over 1,000 fans on Facebook. Don't forget, though, if you're listening online, it's much easier to subscribe on iTunes or with the Stitcher app. That way, each week's episode will be automatically downloaded to your smartphone and you won't miss anything. Also, keep an eye out on our Facebook page for an announcement next week about something special Marilyn and I are cooking up for our 10th episode. Audience participation will be part of that show, and it might be your opportunity to take part. Until then, you've been ShelShocked.